A wealthy man passes away, and his children arrive, eager to claim their inheritance. But what they find waiting for them is beyond anything they could have imagined. Secrets are uncovered, and the truth leaves them reeling. You won't believe what happens next. Subscribe now so you don't miss how this shocking story unfolds. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Sheets of water battered the towering Hargrove estate, a monstrous mansion that loomed over the hill like a watchful predator. Darkened windows reflected jagged lightning strikes, as though the house itself was alive and angry. Inside, the grand foyer was cold, cavernous, and silent, except for the shuffling of leather shoes as family and staff filed in one after another. No one dared to speak above a whisper. Edward Hargrove, the patriarch, was dead. The announcement of his death had sent ripples through the city like an earthquake. Billionaire, philanthropist, master manipulator. His empire stretched across industries, but his personal life was a labyrinth no outsider could navigate. No one knew the real Edward Hargrove, not even his children. The lawyer, Mr. Thomas Lynch, waited stiffly at the far end of the room, his face a mask of neutrality. He stood behind an imposing mahogany desk that seemed to swallow him whole. On it sat an envelope, thick, yellowed, ominous. It bore Edward's unmistakable wax seal. "Where are they?" Lynch muttered to himself, checking his watch. As if on cue, the front door groaned open. Catherine Hargrove was the first to enter. The eldest of Edward's children, she exuded control. Her tailored black dress clung to her like armor, and her heels clicked a sharp rhythm against the marble floors. At 39, Catherine had inherited her father's commanding presence but little of his warmth, if he had any to begin with. She removed her sunglasses, revealing cold, calculating eyes. She barely glanced at the mansion staff who dipped their heads in her presence. She wasn't here for pleasantries. Following her, Lucas Hargrove strolled in with the casual arrogance of someone who hadn't earned a cent of their wealth, but wore it proudly. The youngest at 28, Lucas was all charm on the outside. Messy blonde hair, boyish grin, but his eyes held something dangerous, something sharp. "Nice to see the old man's ego survived him," Lucas said, smirking as he surveyed the room. "Still feels like a museum." Catherine shot him a withering glare. "Do you always have to open your mouth?" "Only when it irritates you, dear sister." The tension between them crackled like electricity. Mr. Lynch cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. And then there was James. James Hargrove, the middle child, entered almost unnoticed. The door had creaked for him, as if reluctantly acknowledging his arrival. James, at 35, was a shadow of his siblings, quieter, subdued, almost forgettable. His brown trench coat dripped rainwater onto the floor, and his eyes remained fixed on the ground. If Catherine was the ice and Lucas the fire, James was the smoke, lingering, silent, and overlooked. "James," Catherine said, her voice softening just slightly, though she didn't approach him. "Catherine." "Lucas," James mumbled, giving each sibling a barely there nod before shrinking into a corner. 3 children, 1 house, 1 dead father. As the clock chimed, echoing like a death knell, Mr. Lynch addressed the room. "Please, take your seats. We'll begin shortly." The siblings obeyed, though Lucas dragged his chair with deliberate noise. Catherine perched straight-backed, every muscle tense, while James slouched, his eyes darting toward the shadows as though expecting something or someone to emerge. The room was oppressive, as though Edward's presence hadn't quite left. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Lucas said, leaning back. "A formal reading of the will. It's like something out of a murder mystery." "Appropriate, isn't it?" Catherine shot back. "You're certainly dressed for the part of the greedy villain." Lucas grinned. "If the shoe fits." James cleared his throat, a rare interruption. "Maybe we could just get on with it?" Before Catherine could scold him for speaking, Mr. Lynch raised a hand, cutting through the noise. "Let us begin." He picked up the envelope and with a practiced hand, broke the wax seal. The snap of the wax breaking was louder than it should have been, as though it carried more weight than anyone wanted to admit. The siblings sat straighter. Lucas's smirk slipped. James rubbed his hands nervously on his pants. Catherine's expression hardened, though her knuckles went white where they gripped the chair. Edward Hargrove was about to speak from beyond the grave. Mr. Lynch unfolded the crisp paper and adjusted his glasses. "To my beloved children," he began, his voice low and measured. "I imagine you're all gathered in the study now, wondering what comes next. Allow me to clear up any misconceptions. I did not bring you here to divide my fortune and send you on your merry way. Life doesn't work that way, and neither did I." The siblings exchanged wary glances. Lynch continued, "I spent my life building an empire, but I failed at building a family. My legacy is tarnished by the distance between us. Some of it my fault, much of it yours." Lucas snorted, earning a sharp elbow from Catherine. "I've set forth conditions in this will. You will not simply receive your inheritance. You must earn it. Prove to me that you are worthy of carrying the Hargrove name. If you fail, you get nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. "Is this a joke?" Lucas demanded, half rising from his chair. "The old man's screwing with us from the grave." "Sit down, Lucas," Catherine snapped, though her voice shook slightly. Lynch ignored them both. "The specifics of your challenges will be delivered to you individually. You have 1 week to complete your tasks. I trust you'll take this seriously. Should you fail to meet the requirements, your share will be forfeit." James shifted uncomfortably. "He can't really do this, can he?" Mr. Lynch folded the letter, setting it back on the desk. "It's legally binding." The tension was suffocating. "This is insane," Lucas muttered, pacing in front of the desk. "The old man's lost his mind. What does he expect us to do? Perform magic tricks for our inheritance?" "It doesn't matter what you think," Catherine said sharply. "We don't have a choice." "I'm not playing his games," Lucas growled, turning toward the door. "He's dead. What's he going to do? Haunt us?" "Sit down," Catherine ordered, her voice icy. "We need to think this through." James spoke quietly. "What kind of challenges do you think he means?" No one answered. Outside, the storm raged on, battering the windows like 1,000 invisible fists. It felt like the house was listening, waiting, holding its breath. From somewhere deep in the mansion, a clock chimed again. This time, it sounded like a warning. Lucas paced furiously, his polished shoes scuffing the ancient Persian rug beneath his feet. Catherine remained composed, her face betraying little emotion, but her eyes flickered with quiet rage. James, as always, sat slumped, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring at nothing in particular. Finally, Lucas snapped. "So that's it? That's the grand plan? We jump through hoops like circus animals just to get what's rightfully ours?" Mr. Lynch cleared his throat, his face an unmovable mask. "I understand this is unconventional. However, Edward Hargrove was explicit in his intentions. The inheritance will only be granted upon successfully fulfilling the conditions he has set forth." "What conditions?" Catherine asked coolly, her voice cutting through the tension. Lynch retrieved 3 sealed envelopes from his briefcase, each marked with a name. He handed them out methodically, one to Catherine, one to Lucas, and one to James. The envelopes were heavy, as if the weight of their father's judgment was sealed inside. "You'll find your individual tasks within. You have until midnight, 1 week from today, to complete them. You are not permitted to share your task with your siblings. This was one of Mr. Hargrove's strictest instructions. Should you fail or refuse, your share of the inheritance will be forfeited and donated to charity." Lucas laughed bitterly. "Charity? Perfect. The man dies and we're still living in one of his ridiculous morality lessons." Catherine turned her envelope over in her hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. "How do you intend to monitor us?" "Each task will require verification. Instructions are included in your envelopes," Lynch replied. Edward was thorough. "Of course he was," Lucas muttered. The tension grew unbearable as the siblings sat with their respective envelopes, none daring to open them. It was Lucas, impulsive as always, who tore his open first. His eyes darted across the page as he skimmed the letter inside. The color in his face drained. "What is it?" Catherine demanded. Lucas folded the letter abruptly and stuffed it back into the envelope. "Nothing," he said, though his voice was strained. "Lying already?" Catherine shot back. "You never could handle pressure, could you?" Lucas rounded on her, his anger flashing. "I said it's nothing. Stay out of it." James watched quietly, his own envelope unopened in his trembling hands. His sibling's anger seemed to bounce off him, though his gaze lingered on Lucas. There was something in his brother's face. Fear. Lucas wasn't known for being scared. Catherine broke the standoff by standing. She smoothed her dress, the picture of calm authority. "If that's all, Mr. Lynch, I'll be taking my leave." Lynch nodded. "You're free to go. I'll remain at the estate this week to oversee matters. Should you need clarification, I'll be available." Catherine turned to Lucas and James, her sharp eyes sweeping over them. "I suggest we all get to work." Lucas scoffed. "Yeah, because that's so like you, Catherine, marching off to do Daddy's bidding." "Better that than throwing a tantrum," she shot back. James finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Enough. This isn't helping." They both turned to look at him, surprised, as though they'd forgotten he was there. James, still clutching his unopened envelope, stood and hurried toward the door without another word. Catherine didn't leave immediately. After Lucas stormed off and James disappeared upstairs, she lingered in the grand study. The flickering light of the chandelier cast strange shadows on the walls. But she wasn't afraid of this house, not anymore. She sat back in one of the leather chairs and carefully opened her envelope. The paper inside was crisp, her father's handwriting unmistakably bold. "Catherine, to the world, you are poised and powerful. You've built an empire of your own, yet you lack what I always wanted for you: humility. For your challenge, you are to spend the next week living as an ordinary person. No assistants, no drivers, no corporate cards. You will work at the Golden Plate, a diner I purchased in your name 6 months ago, and earn a week's wages as a waitress. The manager has been informed of your arrival. I want you to remember what it feels like to be small, Catherine. Only then will you understand true power." Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the letter. A waitress. Her father had known exactly how to needle her pride, even in death. "This is absurd," she whispered. She considered tearing the letter apart, marching back to Lynch, and demanding an end to the charade. But then the words echoed in her mind. "Should you fail or refuse, your share of the inheritance will be forfeited." And Catherine Hargrove didn't lose. Lucas sat in the billiard room, an untouched glass of whiskey sweating on the table in front of him. The letter lay open on the felt surface, the words burned into his brain. "Lucas, you've spent your life hiding behind charm and bravado, but you've never learned accountability. Your task is simple. Locate Daniel Greer, a man whose life you ruined 3 years ago when you destroyed his business through reckless actions. Apologize to him in person and do what you can to make amends. It's time you own up to the damage you've caused, Lucas." Lucas raked his hands through his hair, his chest tight with anger. How did his father know about Greer? That chapter of his life had been carefully buried, locked away with all his other failures. "Damn you, old man," he muttered. He didn't want the money, not really, but he wanted to win. James sat alone in his childhood bedroom, a small lamp casting a soft pool of light across the peeling wallpaper. His envelope lay open beside him, the contents simple but deeply unsettling. "James, you are the quiet one, the forgotten one, the one who slipped through the cracks. Your task is the hardest of all. Find your voice. This week, you must stand before a crowd of strangers and share a truth you've never spoken aloud, about yourself or about this family. You'll know when the moment comes." James stared at the letter, his heart hammering. He could barely speak to his own siblings without tripping over his words. Stand before a crowd? Share a truth? His throat tightened, and for a brief moment he considered walking away, leaving the estate, the money, and the memory of his father behind. But something kept him rooted to the spot. By nightfall, the siblings had retreated to their respective corners of the estate. The storm continued its assault on the mansion, and in the shadows, it seemed the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. Each sibling lay awake, haunted by the tasks before them. Edward Hargrove had always been a man of control, a master manipulator. Even in death, he had them dancing on invisible strings. And yet, none of them could turn back now. The morning air was thick with a damp chill as Catherine Hargrove stepped out of her luxury car, her heels sinking slightly into the gravel parking lot outside the Golden Plate. The diner sat at the edge of town, its faded red and white sign barely visible through the morning fog. A group of truckers sipped coffee on a bench outside, casting curious glances her way. Catherine straightened her blazer and adjusted the oversized sunglasses perched on her nose. She ignored the stares. She ignored the diner's peeling paint and the smell of grease wafting through the cracked door. She had been to Michelin-starred restaurants in Paris, Tokyo, and Dubai. This place was beneath her, but her father's words echoed in her mind. Remember what it feels like to be small. Her hand tightened around the letter in her pocket as she pushed open the door, the jingle of the bell above the entrance ringing out like a death knell. Inside, the Golden Plate was even worse than she'd imagined. A sticky counter ran along one wall, cluttered with mismatched coffee mugs. The booths were patched with duct tape and the tables wobbled under stacks of paper napkins. The smell, fried food, burnt coffee, and disinfectant, made her stomach churn. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" Catherine turned to see a woman approaching. A middle-aged waitress with kind eyes, her gray hair pinned into a messy bun. Her name tag read Betty. She wore a pink apron that had seen better days. "I'm Catherine Hargrove. I was told to report to the manager." Betty's brow furrowed and she let out a low whistle. "So you're the new girl? Mr. Hargrove told us you'd be coming." "New girl?" Catherine repeated, her voice sharper than she intended. Betty gave her a tired smile. "Honey, you're the waitress. Come on, I'll show you the ropes." The morning was a disaster. Catherine had never poured coffee before, much less carried 3 plates of pancakes without spilling syrup on herself or her customers. Within an hour, she'd broken a glass, burned her hand on the coffee pot, and been yelled at by a truck driver for forgetting his side of bacon. Betty watched it all with a mix of patience and quiet amusement. "You're holding the pot wrong," she said gently after Catherine spilled coffee for the 3rd time. Catherine shot her an icy glare. "I don't need advice. Suit yourself." The other staff whispered behind Catherine's back, and the customers stared. She overheard snippets of conversation. "That's the Hargrove girl, isn't it? What's she doing here?" "Probably some kind of punishment. Rich folks are strange." The humiliation stung more than she wanted to admit. Every snide remark, every sideways glance, chipped away at the wall of confidence she'd spent years building. She wanted to scream, to snap back at these people who didn't know her, who didn't understand. But the letter burned in her mind. Remember what it feels like to be small. For the first time in her life, Catherine felt insignificant. By the afternoon, Catherine was ready to quit. She stood in the back room, peeling off her grease-stained apron with shaking hands. Betty found her there, slumped against a crate of canned tomatoes. "I'm done," Catherine said. "This is ridiculous." Betty crossed her arms. "What did you expect, sweetheart? That it'd be easy? I'm not cut out for this." Betty raised an eyebrow. "Not cut out for what? Working? Serving people? Getting your hands dirty?" Catherine glared at her. "You don't know me." Betty chuckled, a soft, knowing sound. "I know enough. I know you've got a chip on your shoulder big enough to knock down this whole diner. You think this place is beneath you, don't you?" Catherine didn't answer. Betty sighed and stepped closer. "Let me tell you something. The people who come in here, they're real. They work hard for what they have, even when it's not much. Your daddy bought this diner, but it's the rest of us who keep it alive. If you can't handle that, then maybe you don't deserve what he's left for you." The words hit harder than Catherine expected. She opened her mouth to argue, but found she had no response. Betty handed her the apron. "You've still got half a shift left. Don't let the door hit you on the way out." Catherine stared at the apron for a long moment before, finally, she took it. That evening, Catherine found herself clearing tables after the dinner rush. Her feet ached, her hair was a mess, and her nails were chipped. Betty sat on a stool nearby, watching her carefully. "You're doing better," she said. Catherine didn't respond. Betty continued, her tone softer. "You know, I had a daughter about your age. Smart as a whip, that girl. She wanted to be a lawyer. Said she'd buy me a house one day." "What happened?" Catherine asked quietly, surprised she cared. "She got sick. We didn't have the money for treatment." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Catherine looked up at Betty, really seeing her for the first time. This woman, who she'd dismissed so easily, had carried her own burdens, ones Catherine couldn't even imagine. "I'm sorry," Catherine said. Betty smiled faintly. "Life's not fair, sweetheart, but it teaches you what matters." Catherine went home that night feeling different. The calluses forming on her hands were small, but they marked something bigger, a change she wasn't ready to name. By the third day, Catherine knew the regulars by name. She knew Tom liked his eggs scrambled with extra cheese, and that Margaret always left a generous tip. She smiled at the truckers and brought Betty coffee without being asked. She still hated the grease, the noise, the exhaustion, but it didn't feel unbearable anymore. On the fifth day, a young mother came in with 2 kids and no money. Catherine watched her from behind the counter as she whispered to Betty, her voice tight with embarrassment. Betty nodded and turned to Catherine. "Make them a plate, on the house." Catherine hesitated. "Won't that come out of your paycheck?" Betty shrugged. "They need it more than I do." Without a word, Catherine went to the kitchen and prepared the meals herself. When she brought them to the table, the woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Catherine's throat tightened. "You're welcome." That night, Catherine sat in her car outside the diner. She pulled the letter from her father out of her bag and read it again. "Only then will you understand true power." She didn't understand everything yet, but for the first time, she thought she was starting to see what her father meant. Quietly, she whispered to herself, "I'll finish this, Dad." In the rearview mirror, the golden plate glowed warmly against the dark night. On the other hand, Lucas sat in his car outside the darkened, run-down bar, staring at the crumpled piece of paper in his hand. Daniel Greer, last known address. The letters were smudged where his fingers had gripped it too tightly. The bar was a far cry from the upscale clubs Lucas frequented. It looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades. "Of all the damn people," Lucas muttered. The memory of Daniel Greer clawed at the back of his mind like a splinter. Greer had been a promising small business owner 3 years ago. A boutique lumber company, fresh contracts with local developers, until Lucas had stepped in. Lucas, chasing a risky investment for his father's firm, had pulled strings to corner Greer out of a deal and secure it for himself. Greer's business had collapsed, and Lucas had never looked back, until now. Lucas took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. He had no plan, no script, just a sinking feeling that this wouldn't be easy. The inside of the bar was worse than Lucas expected. Dim lighting cast long shadows on grimy walls, and the air reeked of stale beer and cigarette smoke. A handful of patrons sat hunched over their drinks, shoulders stooped as though weighed down by life itself. Lucas spotted the bartender, a burly man with a graying beard, and approached. "I'm looking for Daniel Greer. Does he come here?" The bartender didn't look up as he wiped a glass. "Who's asking?" "An old acquaintance," Lucas said carefully. The bartender scoffed. "I'll bet. He's in the back." Lucas followed the man's nod to a corner table where a figure sat slumped over, nursing a glass. Daniel Greer. The man looked older than Lucas remembered, his hair thin, his shoulders slouched, his clothes were frayed at the cuffs, and his face, once full of confidence, wore the hardened expression of someone life had beaten down. Lucas hesitated. Every instinct told him to turn around, to get back in his car and leave. But the letter burned in his mind. Apologize in person. Make amends. Forcing himself forward, Lucas approached the table. "Daniel?" Greer looked up, squinting as though trying to place the face. His eyes sharpened with recognition, and his lip curled. Well, if it isn't Lucas Hargrove." Lucas tried to smile, but it felt wrong. "It's been a while." "Not long enough." Greer's voice was rough, his words sharp. "What do you want?" Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his usual charm failing him for once. "I came here to apologize." Greer laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Apologize? That's rich. Do you think an I'm sorry fixes anything? My business, my life, you destroyed it." Lucas's throat tightened. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try and make it right." Greer's gaze bore into him, full of disbelief and simmering anger. "Make it right? You think you can buy your way out of this? Is that what Daddy Hargrove taught you?" Lucas flinched at the words, a dull ache spreading in his chest. "No, I'm not here to throw money at you, He paused, unsure how to finish the sentence. What was he here for? "I just want to hear you out." Greer stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "Fine. You want to hear me out? Sit down." Lucas pulled out the creaky wooden chair and sat across from Greer. The man took a slow sip of his drink before speaking. "You ruined me, Hargrove. I put everything into that company. My savings, my family's future, it was all tied up in that deal. And you snatched it away like it was nothing. Do you even know what happened after?" Lucas swallowed hard. "No." "Of course you don't," Greer spat. "My wife left me. Said she couldn't be with a failure. My kid, he doesn't talk to me anymore. He's ashamed. And I ended up here." Greer gestured around the bar, his voice thick with bitterness. "This is what's left of me." Lucas sat in silence, the weight of Greer's words pressing down on him like a boulder. In all his life, Lucas had never stopped to consider the consequences of his actions. Business was just business. Winning meant everything, until now. "I didn't know," Lucas said quietly. "No," Greer replied. "You didn't care." For the first time in his life, Lucas had nothing to say. The sharp wit and bravado that had always carried him through difficult situations were gone. In its place was something new: shame. Greer stared at him, his tired eyes searching Lucas's face for sincerity. Finally, he sighed. "Why are you really here? What's this about?" Lucas hesitated. How could he explain? "It's complicated. My father left me with a task. He wanted me to find you and apologize." Greer laughed again, though this time it lacked venom. "Figures. Edward Hargrove. Always the puppet master. Even from the grave." Lucas's jaw tightened. "I'm not doing this because he told me to. I'm doing it because..." He paused, searching for the right words. "Because he was right. I've never taken responsibility for anything. And I can't change what I did to you, but I do care. I'm sorry, Daniel. I mean that." Greer studied him for a long time, the silence heavy between them. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "You want to make amends? Prove it." "How?" Lucas asked. Greer took another sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving Lucas's. "You're smart. You figure it out." Lucas left the bar with Greer's words echoing in his mind. Prove it. What did that even mean? He couldn't turn back this time. He couldn't fix everything he'd broken. But as he sat behind the wheel of his car, staring at the flickering bar sign, one thought kept gnawing at him. He can't fix the past, but maybe he can help build a better future. Lucas spent the night driving aimlessly, his mind racing. Greer was right. He'd never taken responsibility for anything. Apologies were cheap, but action could mean something. By sunrise, Lucas had made his decision. The next morning, Lucas returned to his father's estate, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Mr. Lynch was waiting in the study, as if he'd anticipated Lucas's arrival. "I need access to my trust," Lucas said without preamble. Lynch raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" "I'm going to rebuild Daniel Greer's business, and I'm not doing it for the inheritance. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." Lynch studied Lucas for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Very well. I'll see to the paperwork." Lucas turned to leave but paused at the door. "Tell me something. Did my father know I'd come to this conclusion?" A faint smile crossed Lynch's lips. "Edward Hargrove had faith that, given the right push, you'd find your way." Lucas left the room without another word. 2 days later, Lucas stood outside a small, vacant office building. He'd tracked down Greer again, this time with a plan. "This is yours," Lucas said, handing Greer a set of keys. Greer frowned. "What's this?" "A second chance." Greer stared at him, disbelief written all over his face. "Why?" "Because I owe it to you," Lucas said simply. Greer took the keys slowly, his hands shaking. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a gruff nod, he pocketed them. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Lucas replied. "Just prove me right." Greer's expression softened, and for the first time in years, Lucas felt something unfamiliar, a sense of pride. As he walked back to his car, Lucas realized that his father's task had been less about Greer and more about him. Edward Hargrove had wanted Lucas to confront himself, to see the truth of his actions and choose to be better. And for the first time in his life, Lucas felt like he was better. On the other hand, James sat in the corner of a dimly lit therapist's office, the scent of lavender and faint leather mixing in the still air. The woman across from him, Dr. Evelyn Marks, flipped through a file, adjusting her glasses. "You've been quiet for the past 10 minutes, James," she said softly, her voice calm but probing. "This won't work if you don't engage." James shifted in his chair, gripping the arm so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I don't know what you want me to say." Dr. Marks tilted her head, observing him like he was a riddle. "You received your father's letter, and you came here, which means part of you wants to figure things out. Edward Hargrove gave me instructions, but this is about you now. You're in control of what happens next." James snorted, the sound humorless. "Control? That's funny. My whole life has been out of my control." Dr. Marks nodded. "Then tell me about it. Why do you feel that way?" James looked away, his eyes fixed on the bookshelf behind her. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to feel. But the letter still sat heavy in his pocket, taunting him. His father's words echoed in his mind like an accusation. "You must confront what you've been running from, or it will own you forever." The silence stretched until James finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "You want to know why I'm here? Fine." He rubbed his face roughly and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "I'm afraid of everything. There, I said it. I wake up every day with this pit in my stomach, like something terrible is about to happen. My whole life I've been waiting for the ground to fall out from under me." Dr. Marks listened patiently. "What makes you feel that way? Can you trace it back to something?" James's jaw clenched. "I was 12. The room felt colder as he said it, the words dragging old memories out of their dark corners. "My mom and I were in the car. It was raining so hard I could barely see out the window. She was rushing, trying to pick me up from soccer practice. And then..." His voice caught, his breathing uneven. "Then there was this truck. She swerved to avoid it and we hit the guardrail. The car flipped." Dr. Mark's voice was soft. "You survived." "Yeah," James said bitterly. "I walked away with a couple of scratches. My mom didn't." The words hung in the air like a lead weight. James ran a hand through his hair, his movements restless. "After that, nothing ever felt safe. I couldn't trust anything. Not people, not places, not myself. My dad tried to help, but I could see it in his eyes. He thought I was weak." "Did he ever tell you that?" Dr. Marks asked gently. James shook his head. "He didn't have to. He pushed me to be like Lucas, confident, decisive. But I couldn't be. I froze up in school, in sports, in life. I started avoiding everything. Relationships, risks, responsibility. It's easier to hide." Dr. Marks let the silence stretch, giving James room to breathe. Finally, she asked, "And now? What's brought you here today?" James pulled the letter from his pocket, the paper creased and worn. He handed it to her wordlessly. She unfolded it and read the passage aloud. "James, fear is not a weakness. It is a burden. The only way to free yourself is to face it head on. I have arranged for you to confront what you've been running from. Trust yourself. You are stronger than you know." Dr. Marks folded the letter and set it on the table. "Do you know what he's referring to?" James swallowed hard. "I think so. There's this bridge, the same one where we crashed. I've never driven over it since that day. I avoid it at all costs. He wants me to go back there. And how does that make you feel? James glared at her. Terrified. That's good, she replied calmly. Good? James scoffed. What part of this is good? Fear is the body's way of preparing you for a challenge, she explained. It's not the enemy. It's a signal that you're about to grow. Your father knew that. He believed in you, James. James looked away, his chest tight. I don't know if I can do it. Dr. Mark's voice was firm but kind. You don't have to do it alone. The next morning, James sat behind the wheel of a borrowed car, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The bridge loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the gray sky. Dr. Mark sat in the passenger seat. Take your time, James. He didn't respond. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he stared straight ahead. His breath quickened, every muscle in his body screaming at him to turn around. You can't do this. You're not strong enough. The voices in his head were relentless, but then, over the noise, he heard another voice, his father's, clear and calm. Trust yourself. You are stronger than you know. James's grip on the wheel tightened. He pressed his foot to the gas pedal, and the car began to roll forward. The closer he got, the louder the memories became. The screech of tires, the shattering glass, his mother's scream. Breathe, James, Dr. Mark said softly, pulling him back to the present. You're here now. You're safe. James nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. The car reached the bridge, and for a moment, the panic threatened to consume him. You can stop. You can turn around. But he didn't. The car moved onto the bridge, the tires rumbling against the metal grates. James focused on his breathing, each breath shaky but deliberate. The bridge stretched out in front of him, endless and terrifying, but he kept going. Halfway across, something shifted. The panic didn't disappear, but it lessened, just slightly. James glanced at Dr. Marks, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. I'm doing it, he whispered. Yes, she said softly. You are. When the car finally reached the other side, James pulled over and rested his head against the steering wheel. His heart pounded and his body shook, but he'd done it. He'd crossed the bridge. Dr. Marks placed a hand on his shoulder. How do you feel? James lifted his head, his eyes red but determined. Lighter. Later that evening, James sat in his father's study, the letter still in his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a prisoner of his fear. The bridge hadn't erased his pain, but it had proven something to him. He wasn't weak. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Lucas appeared in the doorway, his expression softer than usual. He really put us through the ringer, didn't he? James managed a small smile. Yeah, he did. Lucas stepped inside, his tone more serious. I'm proud of you, James. You know that, right? James looked up, surprised. You are? Lucas nodded. What you did? That takes guts. More than I've ever had. James looked down at the letter, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He believed in us, Lucas. All of us. We just had to see it for ourselves. Lucas sat across from him, and for the first time in years, the brothers shared a moment of understanding. I think we're starting to get it, Lucas said. Yeah, James replied. I think we are. Meanwhile, Catherine sat in the sleek, darkened kitchen of her penthouse apartment, the city skyline glittering outside the windows. She had spent the last hour staring at the same stack of paperwork, her mind far from the numbers. Her thoughts kept drifting to another letter she received from her father. It arrived 5 days after working at the diner. You must confront what lies beneath the surface, Catherine. Trust no one but yourself, for your journey is different from your brother's. She had no idea what that meant. Her brothers were dealing with their own problems, trying to make amends, finding their paths. But Catherine, she felt like an outsider in her own family. There had been a rift between her and Edward for years, one that had grown after a series of arguments about her career, her life choices, and her decision to never marry. Edward had always been proud of her in public, but in private, things were strained. The tension between them had never quite healed, no matter how hard Catherine tried to meet his expectations. And now, after his death, she was left with a gnawing emptiness. a feeling that there was more to his words than just the surface-level estrangement. She needed answers. Catherine stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the polished floor. She paced back and forth, her heels clicking sharply. What did he mean by beneath the surface? She had always been the pragmatic one, the person who thought things through logically. But with her father's death, something had shifted inside her. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. She couldn't move forward until she understood what he had meant. There was one place that could give her the answers: her father's study. Edward's study had always been off-limits to her and the boys, a sacred space where only he and his trusted associates had entered. But now it was hers to explore. Catherine grabbed her coat and headed out, determined. The mansion was eerily quiet as Catherine made her way down the familiar hallway, past the family portraits and the grand staircase. She had spent years walking these halls, but now everything felt foreign, as if the house itself was holding secrets she wasn't meant to uncover. She reached the study door, hesitated for a moment, and then turned the handle. The room inside was exactly as she remembered: dark wood, old leather furniture, and the faint scent of expensive cigars lingering in the air. But something was different now. There was an unsettling silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Catherine walked over to her father's desk, her fingers brushing across the surface. She could still see the imprints of his hands on the papers he had written. She opened the drawers one by one, methodically searching for something, anything, that could explain his cryptic message. After what felt like hours, she found it. At the very back of the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a pile of old legal documents, was a small, black notebook. It was worn, the edges frayed, and there was no title on the cover. Catherine's heart raced as she opened it, flipping through the pages. Her father's handwriting was there, sharp and deliberate. Notes, calculations, names, and dates. But what caught her eye were the last few pages. They were filled with a strange code, symbols, numbers, and names she didn't recognize. She turned to the very last page, and there it was. A single phrase underlined twice. "You are the key, Catherine. Unlock your past to secure the future." Catherine froze. Her mind spun as the weight of the words sank in. What past? What future? She could feel her pulse quicken as the pieces started to fall into place. There was something in her family's history that no one had talked about, something that had been hidden away for decades, and she was the one meant to uncover it. Catherine sat down in the chair behind the desk, holding the notebook tightly in her hands. The room seemed to close in around her as she thought about her father, about how distant and cold he had been in the years leading up to his death. She had assumed it was simply the pressure of being a successful businessman, but now she wondered if there was more to it. Her father had been a man of secrets. She knew that much. But this was something darker, something more dangerous. She had to find out what it all meant. The next day, Catherine went to the family archives, a vast room filled with old records, photographs, and memorabilia. It had always been a place where her father had spent hours sorting through documents related to the family's businesses, investments, and assets. It had been a part of his life that Catherine had never fully understood, and now, she realized, she needed to. She spent hours sifting through the stacks of paper, her eyes growing tired, but finally, she found what she was looking for. A series of legal documents from the early 1980s, signed by her grandfather, Edward's father. The documents outlined a set of conditions for the family inheritance, stipulations that no one had ever mentioned to her or her brothers. The more Catherine read, the more she realized that her father's wealth hadn't come from the family business alone. There was something else, something that her grandfather had hidden away, something that had been passed down through generations. The inheritance, it seemed, was tied to a series of hidden assets, properties, investments, and trusts that were only accessible under very specific conditions. And Catherine had just stumbled upon the first of those conditions. Catherine sat at the desk in her apartment later that night, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but the full picture was still blurry. Unlock your past to secure the future. It was clear now that her father's cryptic letter was a warning, a guide for her to uncover the truth about their family's wealth. There were things her father had hidden from her, secrets about the origins of the family fortune, the true nature of the inheritance. But why? As she stared at the documents, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the caller ID. It was Lucas. She hadn't spoken to him since, but now she needed to hear from him. "Hello?" she answered, trying to steady her voice. "Catherine, where are you?" Lucas's voice was tense, urgent. "I'm at my apartment," she replied cautiously. "What's going on?" "There's something you need to see," he said, his voice dropping lower. "It's about Dad, about the inheritance. We need to talk." Catherine met Lucas in a small, quiet cafe the next morning, her mind still reeling from the previous night's discoveries. Lucas had that familiar look of someone who had just uncovered something big. "I found something," he said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "It's about the trust, the one our father set up." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Lucas opened the folder, revealing a series of old legal documents, much like the ones she had found. But these were different. They contained names of people Catherine didn't recognize. "This trust," Lucas began, "wasn't just about business. It's about something else, something our father never told us, something he kept hidden for years." Catherine's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" Lucas hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's another heir, someone who has a claim to the inheritance, and they've been kept in the shadows until now." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "Who?" Lucas's eyes met hers, his expression filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. "A child from our father's past, someone we don't know about." The world seemed to stop as Catherine processed the words. Another heir, another piece of the puzzle she hadn't seen coming. Catherine's mind raced as she left the cafe, the weight of Lucas's words pressing down on her. Another heir, someone they didn't know about. The revelation had shaken her to her core. How could their father have kept this secret for so long? And why? What was it about this unknown person that warranted such secrecy? Lucas had seemed just as stunned as she was, but he was also determined. "We need to find this person," he had said firmly, pushing the folder across the table. "I don't care who they are, but we need to know. This changes everything." Catherine had barely heard him. She couldn't stop thinking about that last part of the file. A child from our father's past. Who could that be? Was it possible their father had a relationship, a whole life they didn't know about? She couldn't believe it. Her mind kept going back to the phrase she had read in the black notebook. "You are the key, Catherine. Unlock your past to secure the future." Was this the past her father had been trying to protect her from? The past she needed to confront in order to move forward? As Catherine pulled into the driveway of her father's mansion, the house looming like a dark sentinel, she was filled with a sense of dread and anticipation. She was about to open the door to a secret that had been locked away for decades. The question was she ready to face it? The mansion was even colder than it had been the last time she was there, the shadows stretching long across the marble floors as Catherine stepped inside. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for her to discover something that would change everything. Her father's study was where she had started her search last time, but this time, Catherine didn't go directly to his desk. She went to the far corner of the room, where an old, weathered trunk sat. It had always been there, tucked away behind a bookshelf, and it had always intrigued her. The trunk was locked, but she had never thought much about it. Now, it felt like the key to everything. Catherine knelt down and examined the lock. It wasn't difficult to break. A few moments later, she had it open. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs, journals, and letters, documents from her father's younger years. Many of them dated back to the early 1960s. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. And then, in the very back of the trunk, she found it. An envelope, sealed with red wax. It had her father's initials on it. The letter inside was addressed to her mother. Her heart skipped a beat. She unfolded the letter carefully, her breath shallow. It read, "My dearest Maria, there is something I must tell you before it's too late. Something that has been weighing on my soul for many years. You know about my business dealings, but there is more that I have kept from you. Before our son was born, I made a mistake. I had a child with another woman. A child who will one day come into what is rightfully theirs. The boy's name is Daniel, and he is the product of a love I could never admit to, not even to myself. Please, don't hate me for this. I did what I thought was necessary to protect you and our family. But now, as I grow older, I realize that keeping this secret was a grave mistake. I cannot take it to my grave. You must decide what to do with this information, but I fear that our children will one day find out the truth. And when they do, they will need to confront the legacy I have left behind. Edward. Catherine's hands shook as she set the letter down, her mind spinning. Daniel, a half-brother. The heir her father had kept hidden. The boy who had been left in the shadows all these years. This was the past her father had wanted her to confront. But why hadn't anyone mentioned Daniel? Why hadn't her mother told her? Why had Edward gone to such lengths to keep the secret? Catherine didn't waste any time. She immediately called Lucas, her voice trembling with the urgency of the situation. It's true. Our father had another child. His name is Daniel. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What? Daniel? Are you sure? Lucas's voice was incredulous. I just found the letter, Catherine replied, her voice shaky but firm. He's real, Lucas. Our father had an affair, and Daniel is the result of that affair. He's the other heir. Lucas cursed under his breath. This is insane. Why would he keep this from us? I don't know, Catherine said, her thoughts spinning. But we need to find him. We need to know who he is and what he's entitled to. All right, Lucas said, sounding more focused. We'll get to the bottom of this. Let's meet up and figure out what our next move is. Catherine agreed, her mind already racing ahead. They needed to find Daniel, and they needed to do it fast. But how could they track him down? The next few days were a blur of phone calls, research, and investigation. Catherine used every resource she had to track down any trace of Daniel. She called private investigators, dug through old social media profiles, and even reached out to some of her father's former associates. Finally, after days of dead ends, they found something. A small town in the countryside, about 2 hours away from the city. There was a record of a young man named Daniel Hargrove, born just months before her father's letter was written. Catherine and Lucas drove out to the town the following weekend. The journey was long and tense, both of them uncertain about what they would find. When they finally arrived, they were led to a modest house on the outskirts of town. They knocked on the door, and after a moment, it opened to reveal a man in his late 20s. He had the same striking blue eyes as Catherine, the same angular jawline as Edward. But there was something else in his expression, something guarded, wary. Catherine took a deep breath. Are you Daniel Hargrove? The man stared at her for a long moment before answering, I am. The silence stretched between them. I'm Catherine Hargrove, she said, her voice tight with emotion. I think we need to talk. Inside Daniel's small home, the tension was thick. He listened intently as Catherine and Lucas explained who they were, what they had learned, and why they had come. He didn't say much at first, his expression unreadable. But Catherine could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had known. Deep down, he had always known. So, what does this mean? Daniel finally asked, his voice soft but with a trace of bitterness. What do you want from me? We don't want anything, Catherine replied. We just want the truth. We want to understand what's going on. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. I've been waiting for this moment for years. I don't know if I'm angry, confused, or relieved, but I'm here now. And I guess I owe it to you both to find out what this really means. Catherine nodded slowly, her heart heavy. She had always wondered if there was more to her family's story. But now, standing in front of Daniel, the truth was finally starting to take shape. The atmosphere in Daniel's small living room was thick with tension. Catherine, Lucas, and Daniel sat in a triangle, the silence between them pressing down like an invisible weight. The shock of the truth had yet to fully settle in, and Catherine was still trying to reconcile the reality of it all. A half-brother, a stranger who had been hidden from her and Lucas for years. So what now? Daniel's voice broke the silence, his words slow and deliberate. He looked between Catherine and Lucas, his expression unreadable. "What do you want from me?" Catherine leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "We need to understand what this means, Daniel. My father, your father, left us an inheritance. But it's not just about money. There are things we don't know, things he kept hidden. And now, it looks like you're a part of that. A part of everything." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened slightly. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask for him to be my father, or for you two to show up in my life like this." Catherine's voice grew firm. "None of us asked for this, Daniel, but it's happening now, and we have to figure it out together. There's a lot at stake here. Our father's estate, the family's legacy, everything could change. And we need answers." Daniel stood up suddenly, his hands resting on his hips as he paced around the room. "I don't care about the legacy. I never have. My whole life I've been nothing but a secret. I've grown up knowing I was a mistake. But I'm not your mistake, Catherine. I'm not your problem." Lucas stood as well, his voice calm but insistent. "This isn't about blame, Daniel. This is about understanding the truth. Your father, our father, made some choices that we don't understand. But now, we're all in this together. If we don't confront it, none of us will ever have peace." Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face them, his eyes searching their faces as though he was looking for something. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "All right, I'll help you. But don't think for a second that I'm doing this for you. I'm doing it for me, for the truth. For once in my life, I want to know where I came from." Catherine nodded, a sense of determination settling over her. "Then we're on the same page." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Catherine, Lucas, and Daniel spent long hours in research, combing through old records, legal documents, and family histories. Each revelation led to another question, another mystery that only deepened the sense that the Hargrove legacy was a complex web of lies, half-truths, and hidden agendas. As they dug deeper, they uncovered more about Edward's past. There were whispers of shady business dealings, secret meetings, and investments that never made it into the public eye. Catherine found records of offshore accounts, real estate properties overseas, and businesses that had been kept under the radar. It was clear that her father had built his empire on a foundation of secrets. But there was one thing that stood out above all else. A letter, written by Edward himself, that described a particular investment, one that he had poured his heart and soul into. This investment wasn't just about money. It was about control, power, and influence. It was the key to the entire inheritance. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine as she read the letter aloud. This investment, it's bigger than anything we've ever imagined. He was preparing something monumental, and he didn't tell us about it. Lucas frowned. "What do you mean?" Catherine turned the page. "There's a trust, hidden away in a secret account. The assets are tied to a company called Hargrove Industries, but it doesn't exist on any public records. It's not even listed in any of the family's business dealings." Daniel, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly spoke up. "I know Hargrove Industries. It's a front, a shell company. But there's something else I don't understand. Why didn't my father tell me about this? If he was really trying to include me, why hide something like this from me?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as they all realized the gravity of what they were dealing with. The trust wasn't just about money, it was about power, about who controlled the family's future. And now it seemed they were all bound together by this hidden truth. Catherine, Lucas, and Daniel decided to confront the executors of Edward's estate. They had already gathered a significant amount of information, and they felt it was time to make their move. The meeting was scheduled at a private office downtown, where the Hargrove family's affairs had been managed for decades. The room was cold and sterile, the kind of place where important decisions were made. The executors were seated across from them, two stern-looking men in suits who had been handling the family's wealth for years. They had seen everything, and nothing seemed to surprise them. "Ms. Hargrove, Mr. Hargrove, Mr. Hargrove," one of the executors said with a nod, his voice measured and professional. I trust you're all well aware of your rights to the inheritance." Catherine leaned forward, her eyes steely. "We've seen the will, but there are things in our father's affairs that we don't understand. We've come to you with questions." The second executor, a man named Richard, cleared his throat. "We're aware of some discrepancies, but as far as the estate is concerned, the matter of inheritance is clear. Everything has been settled according to your father's wishes." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "But what about Hargrove Industries? What about the trust? Why wasn't Daniel included in the distribution?" There was a sudden tension in the room, and the executors exchanged a brief, silent glance. "Mr. Hargrove," the first executor said slowly, "we were not aware of any other heirs beyond your immediate family. If there has been a mistake or oversight, it is not something we can rectify without proper documentation." Catherine could feel her pulse quicken. She knew they were lying. There was something deeper going on. She could sense the hesitation, the careful avoidance in their voices. "Show us the documentation," she demanded. "All of it." The executors hesitated, but eventually relented, passing a stack of papers across the table. As Catherine flipped through the pages, she found it, the secret clause that had been hidden from them all. It was a legal loophole, a way for the executors to control the inheritance and ensure that it would never pass out of their hands. This wasn't just about money, it was about control. And now Catherine, Lucas, Daniel, and James were standing at the center of a battle they hadn't anticipated. The days following the meeting with the executors were filled with tension. Catherine, Lucas, Daniel, and James, that just received news of the recent development, met often, trying to piece together the fractured truth of their father's legacy. But with each new revelation, they felt the weight of their father's betrayal more keenly. The executors had known about the hidden clauses. They had known about Daniel. And now, it was clear. They had been waiting for this moment all along. Catherine's frustration grew as she realized that the battle for the inheritance wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about surviving the games their father had played. The legacy they had inherited wasn't just a fortune. It was a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. It was a battle for control, not just against the enforcers who had desperately sought to keep the wealth from being passed on, but for the children who, despite everything, had come together united in their pursuit of justice, determined to reclaim their inheritance and restore the legacy their father had left behind, ensuring that the future would be theirs to shape together. Thank you for walking this path of hope with me. If you're ready for another inspiring story, click the video to the left, and don't forget to subscribe. It's the best way to keep these stories alive. See you in the next chapter of our journey.